Okay. I am Ruth Hennessy, and I'd like to welcome and say thank you for inviting me today, NAPWA. As you say, we've had a long-standing relationship. I work at the Albion Centre, which is a sexual health and HIV focused clinic in Surrey Hills, Sydney. I've worked there for about 26 years or more. And I have a lovely relationship with NAPWA. We provide in our psychology unit a statewide service for people living with HIV. And as you can imagine, being a psychologist, we work with all kinds of concerns and things. Some are very related to HIV, some are not. And obviously, there's an overlap at times with many people's experiences. We do see a wide age range. We see a wide range of people from different cultures, backgrounds, and such. Today, I was asked to look at dependencies and substance use. I must admit, I kind of missed that part of was to potentially look at other behaviours that might be called sometimes an issue for people, which was pornography and social media. I do forgive me, I did forget to sort of add that in, but I do think some of the slides and the ways that we do use and behave will be relevant for those um, concerns and issues for people. And I just want to acknowledge too that I'm talking from not only a clinical experience where I've really gathered and appreciated all the people I've worked with and all the clients. I want to really acknowledge all the experiences I've gained from them and how they've added to both this knowledge and this presentation. I actually shared some of the presentation with some of my clients in the past few weeks. We used it sort of therapeutically, we sort of added to it. Yeah, I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of, I'm sure, very gifted people in the room who have got their own personal experiences, and expertise is a shared experience. So I'm just going to acknowledge the country. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on whose land we meet and work today. I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and those of the future. I'm just recognising that there would be people attending today who have lived experience, both directly or indirectly, and acknowledge that some of this content of this session may bring up or raise any issues for you that I would like you to access some confidential and independent support. I've put up Beyond Blue, who are a very good service nationally, Lifeline. There's also a National Alcohol and Other Drugs hotline, and there's a way of accessing that through email. And oh, sorry, NAPWA, I missed out your spelling, forgive me. But there's peer support navigators and support through NAPWA as well. Today, we're going to look at when is a substance considered a problem, and alcohol and other drugs and mental health and the brain. There's a little bit of brain stuff. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert there, but I do find it relevant and helpful because it does help us understand sometimes those urges and cravings that are coming along. And I look at some brief interventions and some tips and services. And as you said, Adrian said that we're recording it today. So I'm hoping we might use the chat a bit for some interaction. And when we stop recording, we can maybe have a more verbal conversation and discussion. There's no absolute right way of understanding alcohol and other drugs use. As you know, it's probably been fairly one of the most stigmatizing topics in our community and our society. And I just want to make space for the different perspectives that people may have and recognize that our individual experiences will shape our understanding of this and how we experience it. I know that we're very respectful in this room. I've had a really lovely interaction with NAPWA and people living with HIV over the years. So I know that we'll hold that very well. So as I said, it's being recorded. We're going to look at having our microphones muted, but if you're really struggling with that, just unmute yourself if you want to ask something. I will ask for participation using the chat feature, and afterwards we can talk. So in preparing for this talk today, one of the things that came up for me is I really wanted to recognise that there is a lot of harm around the stigma and shame that is associated with substance use or other behaviours that people might judge. And I was really happy, of course, to find that our HIV future study, which I often reference and look at, which is a long-standing, I think it's up to its 11th year, I think, looking at surveying the quality of life for people living with HIV. And I've used that information many a time in various presentations. So I've actually just copied and pasted what this says, and I might just read it out to you. The emphasis on risks and harms associated with consumption of alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs can conceal the way that substance use can also be a part of people's sociability or subcultural practices, which can play a role in connectedness and well-being. The focus on risks also stigmatizes people who use substances, which potentially makes them more vulnerable to poor well-being and isolation. It can also create barriers to accessing health services and and enacting strategies for safer use, which is against the interests of their well-being. It's impossible to untangle the harms arising from substance use from the harm arising from the stigma often surrounding substance use. So with that in mind, and I also have to recognize, because I work in health and I'm seeing people who are coming to me saying that they have problems with this, I could get really biased. I know there's many people using substances, including in my own life and my personal relationships, and they're not necessarily experiencing harm. And I know that obviously there are. So, what are some of the reasons, and if you wouldn't mind popping it into the chat, that we might use substances? Or if you want to unmute yourself and you feel okay with sharing that, that's fine too.
So you're asking us to participate in that question.
Yeah, that's all right. That would be great.
What are the drivers, reasons for substance use? I suppose they can range from enjoyment to actually acting as a form of, using if you've had trauma and you're dealing with mental health fallout.
Beautiful. Yep. So it could be for pleasure, enjoyment, and also for, I guess we sometimes call that self-medication, managing difficult experiences, emotions. Perfect. Any other reasons or ways we might use it?
And that lubricate social interactions.
Totally. We've all heard of Dutch courage and things.
Adrian saying fitting in.
Fitting in, yep. Peer stuff, social influences, being brave.
Uninhibitedness.
Yeah. Help us relax, become uninhibited, disinhibited sometimes. Get away some of that anxiety.
I guess self-anesthesization is what Antha said, which is what we were saying about self-medication, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, anesthetization. And that can be for pain as well. We use a lot of substances for pain, both emotional and physical. Um, and it can be an absolute relaxant. Literally, it does make our muscles relax, which we
And that's
might
what
find difficult.
Del was saying, that to relieve stress.
Yep, brilliant. Is there anything I've missed before I go to my slide, which captures most of that?
Excitement.
Yes. Oh, totally. Totally. I'm feeling excited as we speak, but I'm only drinking water. Brilliant. So it's just recognizing that there are many good reasons and great reasons of why we might use. And some of the reasons we've already touched on. There's that enjoyment. I'm going to talk a lot about the reward and the pleasure centers that drugs activate. We talked a bit about peer, social influences, trying to fit in, being part of something. It can make us feel connected. When we're sharing things, even the act of sharing, whether it's a joint or something that can be seen as a gift or a transaction that's quite positive. There's obviously reasons why we might use related to withdrawal and stopping withdrawal when there's been a physiological dependence or such. I'm going to talk a bit about conditioned responses later, but it certainly can be part of a habit. And we're probably pretty familiar with some of those habits that come up. Stress management and relaxing definitely comes up. Enhancing our performance. So many people might use drugs to enhance their sexual performance. Sport, we know there's been a long history of using drugs in sport to enhance our sporting abilities and such, and we've touched on social. Mood, we're definitely looking at things like management of anxiety, depression, but also things like boredom and just finding some ways of feeling and stimulating. People sometimes aren't experiencing many emotions and there's a numbness, and sometimes they're seeking a numbness through it. I think we used anesthetization was for the word used, which I really like. Um, it also can be used for pain. I certainly know that neuropathy can be one of the ways that sometimes people might use marijuana, for instance. Some people find it helpful for their neuropathy and things like that, but certainly other pains, back pain and such. And we know that we prescribe many substances for some of these things as well. And we're looking at some of the other ways of using drugs in our society that we've typically seen as recreational in a therapeutic sense. And that certainly comes up a lot for pain management, even things like epilepsy and anorexia and things. There's lots of ways that we're using some of those drugs and substances now. Um, Alienation and loneliness can be a part of the experience. And I'm going to touch a bit on genetics and epigenetics here a little bit more, but it's a really big factor. We know that their substance use is highly linked to our early childhood and our genetics experiences. And then when we use substances, it will change our neurological pathways as well. So those are some of the other reasons. When would we say a substance use might be a problem? What would be some of the signs or signals that it's a problem?
Using more than you had initially wanted to.
Perfect. That's pretty much one of the main criteria.
Impacts on your health.
Yeah, the impact on your health. Maybe that's a negative impact in some shape or form. What are we thinking there? Anything in particular?
Lethargy.
Yep. Fatigue, lethargy.
Starting to impact relationships.
Yep. Beautiful. Who's been looking at my slides there, Michael? I think. That's great. Totally. Yeah, social impairment is definitely one of the factors.
Anne's just said financial impacts.
Thank you. I'm having trouble seeing the chat. I did practice before with Adrian, but yeah, if you could read it out for me if I'm missing the
To
chat.
read it out if people are all right with that.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's helpful. So financial, definitely. So yeah, anything that's impairing our life, work, our relationships, anything there, financial is certainly a big one and a driving factor. All right.
Emotional overload.
Yeah. What are you thinking there?
Oh, well, too much stress.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
become psychotic.
Absolutely. Brilliant. So that's a real impairment there, a real impairment on our health. And sometimes we can see, as you say, right up to psychosis, but it can also indicate, even though people might be using it to manage their mood, it can also obviously add to their experiences of anxiety and depression, are particularly the big ones that we'll see. And again, that's partly related on the way that the serotonin and dopamine are being used by these substances in our brain. So you've pretty much covered what I would say. When we're looking at it from a clinical diagnostic perspective, there's this term called substance use disorder. It's not my favorite term in the world by any means, but it is helpful for many people and it does allow access to treatment in this world of medical records and prescription and such. So it is quite necessary at times to get a diagnosis or to have some understanding. Other times it's not so useful. And I'm mindful about how I write my medical notes and things like that to try and be protective, but also to allow people to get the support they might need in this area. So to have a diagnosis of a substance use disorder, you've touched on it right from the start. Impaired control is seen as one of the factors. So it has to have a negative impact on our functioning in some way for it to be called a disorder at all. So the impaired control would look like I'm using more than I expected to or wanted to or would like to. That is either not safe for me to use, whether that's in health or in terms of risk behaviours or damaging my relationships or my work. And maybe I'm using more often than I would like to. So I'm planning not to use, I'm planning not to drink, I'm planning not to have a hit or whatever, but I find myself continuing lapsing around that. So there's an impaired control. So we might even ask people to reflect, have you used more often than you would like? How often is that happening? And things like that. Just try and understand their own patterns of use and what's perhaps the triggers and coming up there. Social impairment we talked about. So when we're seeing impairment on our ability to even attend work, school, our social engagements, many people tell me how they've lost friends because they've not been able to commit to parties or to going to see them socially, and they've not been able to be the good friend that they would like to be. Then there's the risk use. So you've talked a bit about harm to our health, but also harm to our relationships and things like that. Harm to others could be another factor to consider. So if we're driving under the influence, for instance, or we're operating machinery or something in a way that could be seen as a risk factor. And often there's the pharmacological dependence. So we don't necessarily need to see withdrawal for it to still be a problem, but that's what they're often looking for. Their withdrawal symptoms can range to quite extreme, where people can have seizures and problems like that if they were to stop using things, or it can be things like just experiencing headaches and unpleasant mood changes. I'm aware of the time, so I'm not going to spend too much more on this, but another way that we sometimes look at it is the 4 Ls. Does it affect the livelihood? Does it affect my love of life and others? Is there legal consequences? And they talk about liver because liver is our cleaning mechanism and many substances are toxic to our liver. And one of the other reflection points might be is, has somebody else mentioned that they think I have a problem? That can be seen as a bit of an eye-opener for people. So sometimes I don't think it's a problem, but people who care for me are asking me about it or they're noticing something. All right, onward. Substance use and mental health. We're probably pretty aware that there's a bit of a relationship here. We kind of touched on it already. And I guess I just want to recognize that many of us recognize that this is not a failure on our own behalf. Again, there's a real overlap on our genetic composition and our epigenetic vulnerability. So right from early prenatal and early childhood, if our parents have had concerns which are either mental health or alcohol and substance related, then there might be a little bit more of a likelihood in our genetics. Doesn't mean that we're definitely going to end up with an issue or concern. It might be quite the opposite, but it does mean that it might be more of a vulnerability. It can shape, it's because of those early experiences can shape how the brain responds later in life. And obviously, mental health and substances often affect similar areas of the brain. So we layer on environmental influences like stress and trauma. So we can see a chicken and egg sort of relationship. The risk is that alcohol and other drugs and substance use can increase the risk of self-harm and suicide. I'm sure many of us have experienced that sadly in our lives, and we've lost good members of our community. Sometimes that's accidental overdose and death. Other times it is a suicide or self-harm. It can interact with psychotropic medications. I'm aware of the time. I do have a long list of what that could look like, but I guess it's just being aware that some substances can cause some effects around sedation, which can be seen as harmful. It can stimulate things like psychosis and paranoia for some people, particularly those if they have other vulnerabilities like genetic vulnerabilities. Anxiety and depression, it certainly can be an issue because of the serotonin and dopamine use that substances are using. Again, a bit of a chicken egg thing here. And of course, the relationships we've touched on as well. So when we look at these they confine, and they're not just additive, they're interactive. But the important message here is that we aim to help people understand the why and how behaviours develop, not just to be a lecturer and say these things happen, but just to recognize that we need to be trauma sensitive and we look at things with a compassionate lens. This is not a blame game here. This is helping you understand. This is why sometimes it's hard for us to change our behaviors. This is why we've become vulnerable, because we've been working, our ways of coping have always been about survival. We use certain things to cope with things. So they worked for us at one stage, but maybe sometimes they're getting in the way now. They're not working for us anymore. Okay. I work in public health, so I just wanted to recognise that people don't grow up in vacuums. There are many other stresses that go on in our lives that contribute to our experiences. And it's very hard for people to be making significant change if they're going back to high stress environments or there's limited resources. So I'm always amazed by the capacity of change and resilience that I see. Neurological changes in substance use. So I've touched on this a little bit, and I'm not going to pretend to be the expert here, but it's just really recognizing that most of the reasons why we really like some drugs is because they work on our reward receptor. You'll see the term if you do some reading, and they talk about hijacking your reward system. The drugs hijack your reward system. So basically, most drugs help suppress ways of basically they allow for dopamine surges. It's not just dopamine, there's serotonin and some other ones in there, which I'll show you a little bit later. But dopamine is your feel-good drug. It's the one that's associated with reward. We get spikes, but what happens if we start using drugs and releasing our dopamine in this way? Our brain learns in a number of different ways in our reward system that this is the way that I will feel better. Normal everyday rewards don't give me that same spike. So normal everyday rewards feel a bit flat. They don't feel as good. So you can imagine that we start reducing our impulses. We start getting more cravings and things for that dopamine hit. And so what happens in our prefrontal cortex, it makes it harder for us to make other choices because our brain is telling us this is the better way to feel. This is the better way to get that feeling. And what happens with time, again, if we stop using and we've been using for a while, we're going to experience withdrawal. So we're going to feel anxiety, real irritability, cravings and stress. So again, we're getting these signals. Please let me have that substance or whatever that hit is. And then, of course, we've got our memory and learning, which is our hippocampus. And we're going to start these memories of this is how pleasure looks. So as soon as you hear the pop of that cork, that champagne cork, your memory is that brings me lots of pleasure. You'll start associating things in your life. So lots of triggers will start associating of what feels pleasurable. So you can understand why it's not just as easy as to make a change. Now, I was going to put a bit about coffee just because it's our most used drug in society. I don't like coffee, so I'm one of those few. But I put it in here for two reasons. One is just to remind us that, well, that's not very showing up very well. There are positive effects with lots of drugs. So there are some positive effects with caffeine. It is actually a wonderful drug in terms of focus and attention, and people form very well. The downside is it is pretty addictive in the sense of physical dependence. It doesn't take much time before that will become addictive and your body will crave it. In truth, it's telling your brain that you're in an emergency because it's shut down your adenosine receptors. And so suddenly you're full alert and full of energy. You're ready to act. So you don't feel tired and things. But as you can imagine, that wears off. What do you need to perk yourself back up again? Have another hit of coffee. And it becomes a bit of a cycle. Did somebody ask something? Sorry. And then that cycle repeats. And then, of course, it does affect our sleep because it's designed to keep us alert. So there becomes a bit of a vicious cycle. So I just really wanted to let us remind us that it's a very normal drug in our society. It's the most consumed drug in the world. I put in this slide because I wanted us to speak to some of the reasons why alcohol and other drugs may be high in the LGBTQI communities and amongst people living with HIV. And it's important that we frame this in a really non-judgmental and strengths-based way, and recognizing that it doesn't happen in a vacuum, a bit like what I was saying before. It often reflects the ways people connect, cope, and navigate environments that are shaped by stress, stigma, discrimination, and sometimes community norms. It can be a really important, a positive social connection in our communities. Many people experience really lovely ways of connecting with one another. They participate in acts of intimacy and fun, whether that's dancing on the disco dance floor or in sexual ways or in other ways that enhance their pleasure experiences. However, we've touched on some ways that we might be using it as well. And we know that people living with HIV have sometimes experienced minority stress or have had to cope with experiences of exclusion, discrimination, and stigma. And that we know that the mental health challenges and stress and social isolation can make us more vulnerable to maybe using substances more. So it's a complex relationship as always. And also sometimes people who are living with HIV are managing really complex health conditions as well. I touched on a little bit about pain and neuropathy. And there's other ways that we might be using substances as well. We know it can sometimes affect antiretroviral adherence and management of our health conditions and such. So it's worth us looking at, if you like, and how it's being used. I wanted to put a bit more in about aging, but I knew the time was going to be short. But I wanted to recognize that menopausal symptoms may overlap with a lot of withdrawal symptoms, and sometimes we might use substances. So cis women might use, particularly more likely to use alcohol, and then perhaps benzodiazepines to cope with the vasomotor symptoms that happen with menopause and the stress and anxiety symptoms that happen. With aging, there's a general link with cognitive decline and frailty with substance disorder as well.
What's CMA down here?
Sorry, crystal meth amphetamine.
Okay, great.
Yeah, sorry, they were the people that had said how they'd used from the Futures 9, I think that one was. Right. How am I going for time? Not great, am I? You won't overdo it. I'll try and just touch on this. So we've touched a bit on some of our patterns of behaviour. I just want to touch on the reward one, relief and habit and conditioning. We won't have time for the others. We've talked a lot about pleasure and the altered state of emotion and arousal and perception or attitude that substance use can bring us. Like I said, it's not always going to be harmful at all. It can be a really nice experience. I've actually put in a chart there, though, just to give you a bit of an idea of what the dopamine rush is associated with. So good food can give you about 150% experience of dopamine. And then we move on to playing video games, which can also be, a very rewarding behavior for people, and they have triggers and cravings to use again and again. Same with good sex. I don't know where bad sex sits, but good sex can be up there. It can release quite a bit of, dopamine here and such. But look at what methamphetamine can do. It's right up there. So for people who are struggling with methamphetamine use, one of the things I let them know is understandable. It is really the granddaddy of dopamine. It gives you dopamine rushes. It does it faster, better than any other drug that I know of. I'm not sure, there might be others to be discovered, but and it therefore makes it very difficult at times for people to replace it readily. But it is possible. The whole point of treatment is we start looking at different ways that we may get rewarded. It might not be as quick and fast and funky, but it might be more meaningful. It might be more in line with your values. It might be more in line with the kinds of relationships you want to have in your life. It might give you different forms of intimacy that you didn't realize that were possible. The vulnerability of sharing with some others when we've gone through a struggle, we grow a lot, where there is a lot of growth in making change. We get a lot of skills that we can then apply to other parts of our life. We can do it just as well if we've been struggling in this area. So with practice and force changes, we ask people to do this step by step. And I'll show you some ideas of what they came up with when I was doing a bit of a search and a discussion with some clients. The other one we talked about was relief and emotional relief. So as a psychologist, one of the things I would want to maybe help people is some skills building around emotions. Like learning how to understand what emotions I'm experiencing, how I might regulate them, what other ways can I tolerate distress, not adding to emotions, not feeling anxious about being anxious. Let's just sit with the anxiety, not being scared by emotions, just really, and obviously I might use things like mindfulness. I might be building skills in assertiveness, helping them problem solve things rather than avoiding the distressing aspects in their lives. And behavioral activation is another good one. The reason why I might mention that is because once we do exercise or any activity that's a little bit pleasurable and moving, again, we're releasing those neurons in our brain. So we've shown many studies that if people are to participate in an aerobics class, a bit old news really, Ruth, I don't know if there's many aerobics class out there, but if they participate in an aerobics class, that their depression levels will be as good as somebody who's started antidepressant. It'll start changing. And you can understand why. You're doing something that's healthy. You're potentially being in a social environment. You're not thinking about what's wrong with yourself or such, or what your problems are. You're, as I said, releasing adrenaline, cortisols, all sorts of things are being released in a good way. Habit is a really important one that comes up a lot. So we just do things mindlessly. Once we've done them a lot, we just do them mindlessly. I already showed you the picture around the brain. Your memories, all those things are going to be associated with this. So reinforcement, every Friday night for some people, it's wine night. We start thinking about, we start planning when that use is and when we can really go hard or we can go more than we would have. So there's lots of things that might be triggers and habits and things. So people that we use with, people I tend to drink with. I know if I go out with someone, so I'm going to start asking for cigarettes and start smoking their cigarettes, and I've tried not to smoke anymore, and that's going to be really difficult. There's certain places I'm going, if I'm going to go to a pub, how am I not going to, drink some alcohol? Sight, sounds, and smells is really important. It works for some people more than others. But even just the sight of a needle or the sight of somebody drinking alcohol on TV or whatever it might be, that can be enough of a trigger for us to start thinking, I would like to start using again. Time, it can be, like I said, Friday night or the weekend and things like that. Weather can be another thing. If it's a sunny day, it's white wine. If it's cold weather, it's red wine. There's a real truth in the association of things. And then those positive emotions, all those triggers. When we celebrate in our society, we tend to add alcohol to the mix. Don't worry about the dirty banana. So if we wanted to change it, I'm going to just finish up because I'm just aware of the time. We want to start changing it with different triggers and different habits. So a really quick slide on that, which I think shows it. And the good thing is this is recorded and you'll get my slide set, is these are other ways we might reward ourselves. And I got this from the Parkinson's Association, so good on them. And for some people, none of these will kick it for them. I want them to find their own. But these are the other activities that may release the same hormones that some of the substances were. So we all know that patting a dog and playing with a dog is good for our heart. It's partly because of the oxytocin. It's like having a baby when you're nursing a baby. It brings these things out of us. Laughter, best form of medicine, don't they say? But we know that laughter actually helps with pain. We've actually shown that if people can find ways of laughing, again, it's releasing the positive hormones. If we're doing things that we feel proud of, if we're engaging in difficult things or completing tasks and doing something self-nurturing, we're going to get that reward, not only on a neurochemical way, but also actually by what we say to ourselves. So that's really important. I've completely gone over time. I do apologize. Shall I wind up and just maybe I'll just end on this idea of what can I cut out, Ruth? What can I? One of the things I would ask people to, if we're trying to make change, is we start thinking along the lines of what's the disadvantages of continuing what I'm doing? What's the advantages of stopping or changing? What do I feel optimistic about change? What tells me what other things have I managed to change that were difficult in my life? What's my choices here? What's my intention here? Recognizing I always have a choice. Sometimes they're not great choices. They might be limited, the choices, but there's always a choice. Well, how does my behavior fit with my goals and values? If I am seeing myself as a healthy person, I exercise, I do all these things, I eat, and I see, how does this behavior fit in with that? It is a disconnect here. And we start making a plan. We'll also look at things like making it harder. Don't rely on willpower. People often see it as a personal failure. It's not your willpower. You've just heard how difficult it is, what has set us up for these behaviors. It's recognize that we need some support usually to make change. I can't rely on my willpower. You know, if there's a chocolate cake there and I'm hungry and whatever, I might steal it from you. I'm just going to have to make sure that I have enough chocolate in my life so I'm not stealing from my friends. It's a really daggy example, sorry. But try to make it harder. Look at things that will make it more difficult for you to engage in the behavior. Keep track of what you use, practice how to refuse, get some support and help. Don't, you can't do anything about cravings. They're going to come up, but how we work with them is going to be different. There's lots of ways that we can get help in terms of groups. Many people find the 12 Steps programs really helpful. So I've got Alcohol Anonymous there, Narcotics Anonymous, Crystal Meth Anonymous. There's the Rainbow Room. There's lots of ones. And then there's Smart Recovery. The services are there. Look, I spelled NAPA correctly, I'm glad to say. There's some books and reading. I don't know if you guys have ever seen You Can't Ask That on the ABC. There's a really good episode on substance use and use of medications and things. There's a really good one on people living with HIV too. I'm sure maybe some people have seen that too. And there we go.
Thank you, Ruth.